Hello, my name is Chloe Noller. I'm on the Beyond the Bubble podcast with Career Services. I'm here with Nate Stewart. Thank you so much for joining us today. First off, can you tell us who you are, what you do?
My name is Nate Stewart, as you noted. I'm an attorney at the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., but I relocated and I now work here right on campus. My wife and I bought the old Delta Tau Delta house across the street from College Baptist Church, and we've been here for about 2.5 years. I work remotely for the DOJ, at least for the time being, and we'll see what happens in the coming weeks and months.
Can you tell us how you got to Hillsdale, why you attended Hillsdale, what drew you there?
Graduated Hillsdale in 1995, so I arrived here in the summer of 1991. Came to Hillsdale. I had heard of Hillsdale. I had some friends, acquaintances, people who had sent their children here. And I was actually out at a place called The Summit, which was a small little 2-week summer camp out in Colorado. Okay. The summer between my junior year and senior year of high school. And I was playing pickup basketball with one of the guest speakers who happened to be at the time, this would have been about 1990. He was the captain of the U.S. debate team. And during the basketball game or shortly thereafter, I asked him, I said, well, where should I go to college? Because I really had no idea. And he looked at it and he said, well, what do you want to study? And I said, well, I think I want to study journalism. I was the editor-in-chief of my little high school newspaper, and I thought, well, I'll go into journalism. I thought I wrote fairly well, and I enjoyed that sort of thing. And so I said, well, I want to study journalism. And he said, well, does it have to be a Christian school? And I said, no. And at the time, Hillsdale wasn't sort of advertising itself, promoting itself as a, quote, Christian school. It was a conservative college, certainly, and it had that reputation, but it hadn't sort of embraced that nomenclature then. And he sort of looked at me and said, well, good. You won't find one.
Wow.
So he said, if you're going to go west of the Mississippi, you go to Claremont McKenna. And if you're going to have to stay east of the Mississippi, you go to Hillsdale College. And that's it.
Wow.
So I went home. I reported back to my parents. My father had read about Hillsdale College, I think in the back of National Review magazine. And we, again, had sort of family friends who had attended here. So that was it. I applied to Grove City College in Pennsylvania, and I applied to Hillsdale. I wasn't going to go to California and go to Claremont McKenna. So I ended up here.
What did you major in? What were you involved in on campus?
I did not become a journalism major. I don't know exactly how that happened. I became an American Studies major. I couldn't decide between English and politics and history, and American Studies let me do all of them without having to, worry about Shakespeare or worrying about, ancient things, things that I didn't really understand or wasn't too interested in at the time. So American Studies it was. As for things that I was involved in, I came here and played freshman year on the football team as a walk-on, which was rather unexpected. That only lasted the first semester, and then the second semester of my freshman year, I joined the debate team. And I did that for, I think, maybe 3 of my 4 years here. I did do debate. I did do a little bit of writing for the Collegian, mostly just as sort of a features editorial writer. I would write the occasional piece. I was in Phi Mu Alpha, and I did music and that sort of thing, although I wasn't terribly talented at that. But those were sort of my main involvements. A little bit of InterVarsity, and that was about it.
Did you have any particular classes that really stuck out to you?
I really enjoyed some of my English literature classes, the American literature classes. I really kind of enjoyed everything in my major. I don't know that there was any one particular class that stood out. Political science became an interest. I did do the WIP program my junior year. That sent me down to Washington, D.C. the spring right before the Republicans took over in 1994 and retook the House of Representatives. So I was not there when they became the majority, but I was there at the tail end of their minority. And I made some lifelong friends in doing that and had a great time.
So you went to law school. What was your journey there? How did you end up there? Did the American Studies major help you decide that you wanted to go to law school, or was that a plan you already had?
By the time I finished here, I was done with school. So I reached senior year and I had senioritis and I was tired of exams and essays and deadlines and all of that. I had sort of burned out. My best friend at the time was on his way to medical school and, a master's before that. And he was ready to embark on all of the extra graduate education. And I looked at that and said, not me. I am not doing any of that. So my journey to law school, ironically then, right, was a bit delayed. It was a winding journey. That was not a straight road right out of undergrad. And that was probably a very good thing. One, because I was burned out and I was tired, and so I wouldn't have been focused or terribly interested in it. But it also gave me time to get some experience and gain some perspective and do some just natural maturing with age. And I think that's been helpful, and that was a good thing. So my journey was I left Hillsdale, got a job through contacts made through the WIP program down in Washington, D.C., worked for a small little think tank, did writing for them. Thought, I'm just going to plug into Washington and get into politics and eventually work for a congressman or a senator or something like that. Wasn't really sure, but figured that's what I would do. My parents had an opportunity to move overseas, and they were going to do that, assuming that I was sort of ensconced in the swamp, and would have no interest as a young 20-something in joining them. But I was sort of unhappy with my job and dissatisfied and was going to be looking for other work. And so when they said, well, we're going to go over to Scotland and spend a year, you're welcome to come, but we don't expect you to. I took them up on it. And I said, well, I want to go to Scotland. So I shocked my family. I shocked my friends. I kind of just left my job. And I thought, well, I'll be between jobs anyway. I might as well be off for a year. And so that's what I did. And I went to Scotland for a 10-month Bible survey seminar kind of course, 10-month survey course. That my parents were taking, and I took it alongside them. I met my wife there. So she's not Scottish, she's Canadian.
Oh, wow.
But she was over there doing the same sort of thing. So we met while we were both there studying, came back to my home of Cleveland, Ohio. I thought I would just go right back to Washington, D.C., but my girlfriend who became my wife said, well, I'm not going to go live in Washington, D.C. I don't know anyone there, and that place sounds ridiculous. And no, I don't want to live in Washington, D.C. So we moved back to Cleveland, Ohio, where I am from. I decided it was time to go back to school. So I had kind of gotten once I was doing this Bible survey, I really sort of latched onto that. And it wasn't accredited. It didn't have a degree. It wasn't like I had gotten a master's. So I thought, well, let me just go back and get a master's. So I then did a master's in religious studies at John Carroll University.
Wow.
And I did that while I was working for a law firm. And I actually worked for two law firms before I went to law school. And it was at the second firm while I was taking my master's that the lawyers there sort of convinced me, you could be a lawyer if you wanted to be. And I said, well, I don't think I'm going to be a religious studies or, professor or theologian, although that was kind of on the table at the time. But we decided that we didn't want to pursue a PhD in systematic theology or in bioethics, in part because my wife said, well, if you go get a PhD in systematic theology, I am going to end up living in some cornfield somewhere working, while you work for some tiny little college where they will maybe hire you. I had also been studying bioethics at John Carroll, and that was kind of part of my curriculum. And lo and behold, if you could do bioethics if you had a terminal degree, if you had either a PhD, an MD, or a JD. And Case Western Reserve University Law School in Cleveland had a very highly rated, well-regarded health law and bioethics program.
Wow.
And that was just down the road. So instead of doing a PhD somewhere else in the country and uprooting my wife and my children, we stayed put, and I went to law school, thinking that I would do bioethics or health law of some sort and maybe get hired by one of Cleveland's hospitals or, do something of the sort.
How did your theological education translate to law school? Did you find that had helped you in any way?
I think subject matter, it was unrelated. Again, except that the bioethics part I thought would translate, that I had done this sort of bioethics research and writing and thinking and reading about all of that while at John Carroll. And there was that element in law school. It's just that I quickly lost interest from the legal perspective. The classes weren't all that entertaining. And I ended up sort of going back to my first love of politics and history, and I became, in sort of a providential way, I guess my faculty advisor who was randomly assigned to me happened to be one of the only two conservatives on the Case Western faculty. And he was a writer for National Review magazine. And I recognized the name, or he had told me that or something, and it was, I actually have a conservative libertarian law professor who was brand new at teaching constitutional law and was only a few years older than I was. And so I kind of came under his mentorship, and he kind of guided me through law school, and that meant I was actually now more interested again in sort of constitutional law and First Amendment law and more political things than health things. The health law faculty was incredibly liberal, and that was sort of frustrating and off-putting.
So what led you to the Department of Justice?
Well, I spent 2 of my law school summers interning at the Department of Justice. And that came about because I spent my first summer after the first year of law school, I interned for a federal court of appeals judge, where I met someone who knew some people at the DOJ. And so when I was then up for now I'm after my second year, I need another internship because that's sort of how law school summers go, is you're immediately looking for some other, internship, externship, or a summer job in a firm. I was recommended, or a friend of mine there from the judge's chambers recommended me to work at this small little office inside of the DOJ, the Office of Justice Programs is what it's called. But I didn't think that I would end up there. I mean, you kind of put out all of the feelers and the resumes and all of that. And I didn't end up there immediately. So after law school, I ended up clerking for that same judge that I had interned with on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. And from there, we sent out all the feelers again for, where do I get permanent work? And the firm that was the best fit and that hired me was down in Washington, D.C. So I ended up working for it's called Big Law, a big law firm based out of New York City, international global firm that had a presence in Washington. Apparently, I think it was my clerkship for this particular judge that caught the attention of one of the partners at the firm, who was a Federalist Society conservative. And so I got that job first after my clerkship. Spent 4 or 5 years there, I think. Remained in touch with the attorney that I had worked under at the DOJ in the Office of Justice Programs. He was just down the street from me, and when we had stayed in touch, and we would occasionally ride to work or ride home from work together, just as a matter of convenience. And then when the financial crisis happened in 2008, 9, 10, law firms, even the big law firms that historically had never really done layoffs or done any of that sort of thing, started doing that. And everyone hit the panic button because there was no real rhyme or reason to what was going on. They didn't lay me off, but I knew that I needed to get out of that environment, and the environment was not conducive to having young children and raising a family and any kind of normal lifestyle, at least is how I defined normal. So I made inquiries with my friend at the Office of Justice Programs, and after probably about a year, I think it took him, we were able to move over there, and I've been there ever since 2011.
That's quite a journey.
Yes.
To the Department of Justice. So you kind of mentioned you didn't want to stay in the big law environment. What helped you find the work-life balance, if you will? You mentioned your family. I also wanted to mention your art. You have a passion for art. There's currently a gallery up at Hillsdale right now. I'd love to have you talk about that as well and how you got into that. Just balancing passion projects with a career in law. Love to talk about that. So first, how did you get into art?
Slowly. I think it was slowly. I do like to tell people now, I suppose, now that I've thought about it for a little bit, at law school, Case Western Reserve Law School is right across the street from the Cleveland Museum of Art. Mm. And so if we don't tell my wife this, occasionally during study breaks or, I would walk across the grass and go hang out in the art museum and just sort of relax and take it in and have some time to decompress from the studying. So I think that there was an appreciation that got developed a little bit, even during law school. I didn't get into any sort of real collecting of it for a number of years later, though. I had met an artist through family connections that I had become friends with in Ohio, and I had always told him that when I had a real job and I actually had money, I would like to purchase some of his original work and not just reproductions and prints. Mm-hmm. And he said, sure, that'd be fine, not really believing me that I was going to do something like that. But a few years after moving to Washington and having a real job and, finally having some disposable income, I was able to sort of make good on that promise. And we bought a painting from our friend. And once we hung it, it sort of overshadowed everything else in the room. It was like, well, now we have this really cool, fairly large oil painting that put everything else in the house to shame. And it was, well, now one thing here is not like the other. So we needed more. And I've always been a collector at heart, a collector by nature. I was always collecting various things. And my wife and my children would sort of laugh at me and say, well, that's fine for you, but it doesn't really help the rest of us, some of my earlier hobbies. And so art became something that I thought, well, actually, everyone can benefit from this. This isn't something just for me. We're going to sort of beautify the house and hopefully cultivate an interest and an appreciation among our children. My wife could enjoy it, and we could do this sort of together. Was kind of the thought behind it. That was sort of how it got started. So, and then it just sort of snowballed, and now it's out of control.
How did you balance a rigorous legal career beginning this passion in art? And how would you say you balance that now between working with the Department of Justice and balancing this art collecting where you're, finding young artists across the world? How do you balance that?
It's not that hard. I'm not at the big law firm. If it was at the big law firm, two things would be different. I would have a lot more money and a lot less time. Mm. And that we kind of figured out with big law that was the trade-off. And we were willing to make that trade-off pretty early on in my career. So life at the DOJ is much more sane and normal. I have a great boss with great colleagues and coworkers, and it's very much a team effort. And the workload is manageable and, sensitive to family needs and personal desires. When COVID happened and we were all sent home for as long as we were, and the opportunity to move to Hillsdale presented itself, and I reached out to my boss and I said, do you mind if I work from home in a different state? And he said, no, because we're all working from home and it looks like we will be for some time. So that has afforded me not as much money as staying in the law firm would have, but certainly the time to kind of cultivate that interest and focus on it. And that's kind of, it's become my hobby. And it doesn't interfere with my work day and getting my work done and my responsibilities, but it's what I enjoy doing on the side. And that hasn't, with the federal government, that hasn't been an issue.
Is there something you wish you had known before starting law school? And you had a pretty meandering journey to get to law school, but thinking back on it now, for people who are looking to get into law school, wanting to make a career of that, is there something you wish you had known before getting into the legal field?
Being kind of the non-traditional older student, I think when I got to law school, I was maybe 25, 26. That actually helped a lot. And looking back on it, what I can tell you is that a lot of the people who did very well in law school, at least in my class, were the non-traditional older students. I was on the law review there, which I can talk a little bit about. And looking back at who was on that law review, most of it was made up of older students. Virtually all of the, what we call in law review, the executive board, the executive editors of the law review were all non-traditional older students. Most of us, by the time we got to that, were about 30.
Wow.
You're kind of, the executive board is your third year, and I think I was probably 30 by then, and most of the other people on the board were in their late 20s or early 30s as well. So I will say that for those thinking of law school, the rush to go right from undergrad into graduate school or into law school may not be as dire. You may not really want to do that. I think the thing that surprised me coming out of law school was the degree to which law firms were sensitive to the kinds of classes and experiences that I took advantage of in law school. I was really surprised by that. I kind of went in thinking, you get good grades, you learn how to write, you take good classes, and, get your internship, externship, work for a judge, clerking for a federal court, whether it's the district trial court or the appeals court, is a huge thing. Everyone seems to recommend doing that. What they don't tell you is that in certain firms and in certain markets, that actually works a little bit against you, which I did not know. So in Cleveland, Ohio, for example, I thought, well, a Sixth Circuit clerkship, in Ohio that's it. And then you find out that smaller firms in the other towns, not the big cities, worry that someone who has that interest and that level of experience won't want to stay with them and just be a run-of-the-mill, grind-it-out, corporate lawyer. And I didn't know that going in. I thought corporate law, big corporate law, everybody's the same. You just want experience. You want somebody who can handle the law. And I was told after the fact that, well, when we look at your resume, Mr. Stewart, you're a little overqualified. They didn't really use that word, but they said, well, we don't think you're going to stick around. And what the law firms don't want is we train you for 5-6 years. You know what you're doing now, but then you get bored and you decide it's time to move on. And so they've put all of this sort of effort into like grooming you, and then you're going to disappear. So I actually had a friend who was a partner at one of the Cleveland firms that would not hire me tell me flat out, we look at your resume and you're either going to be in academia or you're going to be working for the government.
Wow. But
nothing on your resume says you want to be a corporate lawyer. So just going in, realize that what you do, the classes you take, the things that you write about, the internships that you pursue or land, they end up mattering in both directions. They can squeeze you out of smaller markets. They can open doors, and no doubt, but just be prepared that if you want to be in a small market or do the small, hometown lawyer thing, some people may look at that and say, you're not worth the risk. You're a flight risk, is kind of what they told me. So, and sure enough, where did I end up? I ended up in Washington, D.C. doing big corporate law and thought about joining academia, and ultimately I'm at the federal government. So they were right.
Well, I think that's all the time we have today from Mr. Stewart, but I thank you so much for coming on and just sharing your insights into your career and your education and journey through Hillsdale. I hope it can help other Hillsdale students thinking about getting into law specifically. So thank you for your time.
Sure. You're very welcome. Thanks.